The wind cut through the plains like a blade, carrying a chill that penetrated Lily's thin dress and prickled her skin. Her lungs burned from the relentless sprint across the rough, uneven ground. Every step she took seemed to echo in the emptiness around her. The only sounds, the crunch of dirt beneath her feet and the distant howling of the wind. She had left everything behind: home, family, and the town that insisted she follow a life that felt suffocating, like a cage. Now, the night was her only companion, and uncertainty was her constant shadow. Her bare feet were scraped and bloody, and the hem of her dress was torn and soiled. She tried to ignore the ache in her calves and the sharp sting in her soles as she pressed on, driven by sheer desperation. Somewhere in the distance, she glimpsed the silhouette of a barn, its massive shape looming like a dark sentinel against the faint silver of the moonlight. Her chest tightened with hope, then fear. Could she risk approaching it? What if it wasn't empty? What if the owner was hostile? Her instincts screamed at her to keep running, but exhaustion slowed her, forcing her to pause behind a gnarled fence post. She crouched low, hugging the shadows, her heart hammering in her chest. The barn was old, wooden planks, weathered by years of sun, wind, and rain, but sturdy. The large doors were slightly ajar, swaying with a groan each time the wind pushed against them. Lily's hand shook as she reached out and pushed the door open just enough to slip inside. Praying the darkness would conceal her, the air inside the barn was thick with the smell of hay, earth, and the faint tang of livestock. Dust floated in the beams of moonlight streaming through the gaps in the wooden walls. She pressed herself against the rough interior wall, holding her breath, listening intently. Her ears strained for any sign of movement, any hint that she had been discovered. Then came the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, reverberating through the barn. Her stomach clenched. She turned slowly, expecting to see a shadow, and saw a figure emerge from the far corner. He was enormous, a giant of a man, broad-shouldered and towering, with arms that seemed capable of bending iron. His hair was untamed, falling into his eyes, but it couldn't hide the intensity in his gaze. Lily froze, caught between terror and a strange sense of awe. "Who's there?" The voice was deep, calm, and unwavering, carrying a quiet authority that made her feel as though the earth itself had stopped to listen. I need shelter," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her throat was dry, and her lips quivered as the words left her mouth. The man's eyes softened slightly, but there was still a weight in his stare that made her want to shrink back into the shadows. "From what?" he asked. His question was simple, yet it carried an undertone that suggested he understood more than he let on. "From people. I had to get away," she admitted, her voice breaking. She wanted to explain more, to tell him everything, but the words lodged in her throat. Fear, shame, and exhaustion tangled together. Leaving her nearly speechless, he stepped closer, each movement deliberate, measured, like a predator circling but with no intent to strike. The barn felt smaller under the breadth of his presence, and Lily's instincts screamed at her to run, yet her legs refused to move. He stopped just a few feet away, letting the silence stretch between them like a fragile thread. "All right," he said finally, his tone firm but not unkind. "You can stay," but his gaze fixed on hers, unwavering, and she felt the weight of every word before he spoke it. "If anyone asks where you are, you're my wife now." The words hit her like a cold gust of wind. Her eyes widened, and her mouth opened, but no sound came out. It wasn't just what he said, it was the certainty in his voice, the lack of hesitation or doubt. He wasn't joking. The enormity of him, his quiet authority, made her tremble in ways she hadn't expected. She felt both alarmed and strangely reassured, as if by agreeing to this unspoken pact, she could finally stop running. The man crouched slightly, his massive frame bending to meet her at eye level. Moonlight flickered across his rugged features, highlighting the sharp angles of his face and the faint lines etched by years of hard living. "No one's going to hurt you here," he said softly. "You're safe. That's all that matters." Her pulse slowed a fraction, and she nodded almost imperceptibly. She could feel the tension in her body begin to ease, just a little, though fear still lingered like a shadow. He straightened again, turning to attend to a stack of hay, his movements fluid and controlled. Lily watched him, captivated by the quiet confidence that seemed to radiate from him, a presence so solid and unyielding that it felt like she could lean on it without falling. Minutes passed. The wind outside rattled the barn doors, and the shadows inside shifted as if alive. Lily stayed huddled against the wall, trying to collect herself, her chest heaving with a mixture of relief and lingering dread. She stole glances at the man, who moved with a purpose that suggested he was used to solitude, used to the rhythm of life dictated by the land and the animals he tended. There was no malice in him, no threat, only an overwhelming sense of control, of strength. Finally, she took a tentative step forward. "I thank you," she murmured. Her voice was still shaky, but gratitude managed to rise above the fear. He didn't respond with words, only a small nod, acknowledging her presence without making her feel small or powerless. Instead, he went about his chores, stacking hay, checking the barn for loose boards, his broad shoulders moving with effortless strength. Lily realized she could breathe a little easier now, could start to believe that, at least for tonight. She was not alone. For the first time in hours, or maybe Dashi allowed herself to sink into the hay, curling up and closing her eyes. The wind's howl was still there, but the barn, the enormous man, and the safety of this place formed a fragile cocoon around her. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or the day after, but for now, she had shelter. For now, she was alive, hidden, and somehow, in the presence of this giant, she felt a strange glimmer of hope.
The morning light filtered softly through the cracks in the barn walls, casting streaks of gold across the dusty hay. Lily stirred, blinking against the pale light, her body stiff from sleeping on the uneven hay. The scent of hay, earth, and a lingering faintness of leather hung in the air, and for a moment, she let herself breathe, feeling the safety of the barn embrace her like a fragile shield. The wind outside had softened, carrying with it the distant call of birds and the gentle rustle of grass across the plains. She carefully rose to her feet, wincing as sore muscles protested. Her dress, damp with the morning dew that had seeped in through the open barn door, clung uncomfortably to her skin. She walked slowly toward the doorway, peering out at the wide expanse of land that stretched endlessly before her. In the distance, the man she had met last night moved with a quiet confidence among the animals and equipment. Even from afar, he seemed impossibly large, his movements deliberate, steady, and almost graceful for a man of his size. "Good morning," she called softly, her voice carrying more than she intended, and she immediately felt foolish for breaking the silence. He turned at the sound, pausing mid-step with a hay rake in his hands. His eyes, sharp yet kind, found hers, and a faint smile tugged at the corners of his lips. "Morning," he said simply, his voice calm and steady, a grounding force in the vastness of the plains. There was no judgment, only the quiet acknowledgement of her presence. Lily hesitated, unsure of what to say next. Her heart still fluttered with anxiety, but a subtle warmth spread through her chest at the sight of him, a feeling she hadn't expected. "Thank you," she said, her words barely above a whisper. "For last night." He nodded, brushing dust from his jeans as he leaned against the fence post. "Don't thank me yet," he said with a small chuckle, though there was a seriousness underneath. "You're still hiding." His eyes softened as he added, "But you're alive, and that's what matters." She swallowed hard, her throat tight with a mix of gratitude and lingering fear. Why would you help me like this?" she asked, finally letting the question slip out. She was afraid of his answer, afraid that the generosity she had glimpsed would vanish if she pressed too far. He leaned on the fence, crossing his arms and studying her quietly. "I know what it's like," he said slowly, his voice low and measured. "To be alone. To feel like the world doesn't care if you make it through the night. I've lived that way for a long time, and I don't like it." He paused, letting the words hang between them, heavy with meaning. "I've got space. I've got work. And it looks like you've got nowhere else to go." Lily looked at him, searching his face for signs of mockery, deception, anything that might betray hidden motives. But she found none, only a raw honesty, a steadiness that made her chest ache in a way she didn't understand. Slowly, cautiously, she nodded. "Then, I suppose I can stay," she said, her voice tinged with hesitation. "For now." "Good," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "Because if anyone asks, you're still my wife." The corners of her lips twitched into a small, incredulous smile. The words should have alarmed her, yet spoken by him, they felt more like a shield than a threat. She shook her head, partly in disbelief, partly in amusement, and something inside her loosened, a tension she hadn't realized she had been carrying. The days began to settle into a rhythm. Lily helped him with chores, feeding the animals, stacking hay, scrubbing water troughs, and repairing fences. At first, every task felt foreign, her hands clumsy and unskilled. But he was patient, correcting her gently, guiding her hands when she faltered, never raising his voice. The way he moved, with a confidence born from years of labor and solitude, made her feel both humbled and inspired. She began to take pride in her small accomplishments, in the way the barn gradually became less intimidating and more like a home. He rarely spoke unless necessary, letting the quiet of the land fill the spaces between them. Yet, in that silence, she began to sense a connection, subtle and steady, that went beyond words. A shared understanding that both of them had been lonely, both of them had known fear, both of them had learned to survive in a world that was often harsh and unfeeling. One evening, as the sky burned with the colors of sunset, Lily worked to fill the water troughs while he tended to the animals nearby. The sun glinted off his broad shoulders, and she paused, watching him with an almost reverent awe. His movements were efficient, deliberate, and somehow graceful, and the wind tugged at his hair, giving him a wild, untamed air. For a moment, she forgot her fear, her flight, her past. All that mattered was this moment, this man, this quiet life on the edge of the plains. I think I can stay," she said finally, the words trembling out of her mouth. She didn't know if it was courage or desperation that made her speak them, only that the truth demanded release. He turned to her, a faint, approving smile playing at his lips. "Good," he said simply, his voice carrying warmth and an understated gravity. "Because if anyone asks, you're still my wife." She laughed softly, a sound mingled with relief and disbelief, shaking her head at the strangeness of it all. Yet, in that laughter, there was freedom. The fear that had driven her across the plains, the terror that had haunted her every step, began to loosen its grip. She realized that here, with this man, she was no longer running. She could finally rest, breathe, and maybe, even begin to imagine a future that wasn't dictated by the expectations and cruelties of others. The stars appeared, one by one, in the deepening indigo sky, and the vast plains seemed to stretch endlessly, a world of possibility framed by the warmth of a barn and the presence of a man who had chosen to protect her. They stood side by side outside the barn, the silence between them comfortable, companionable. In the simplicity of the moment, Lily understood that trust, once earned, could feel like the strongest anchor in the storm. As the night deepened, she felt a quiet sense of belonging, a fragile, cautious hope that perhaps she had found more than just shelter. She had found safety, protection, and an unexpected companionship in the most unlikely of places. The giant cowboy, with his quiet strength and steady presence, had offered her more than shelter from the storm. He had offered her a chance to begin again, to breathe, to exist without fear. And for the first time since she had fled her old life, Lily allowed herself to imagine that she could belong somewhere, that she could be more than just a runaway girl hiding from the world. Here, in the shadow of the barn and under the watchful eyes of the lonely giant, she felt the first stirrings of hope, and perhaps, in time, something more.